The official world map tells you that the war in Vietnam ended on April 30th, 1975. The history books call it a closed chapter. The neon-lit skyscrapers of Ho Chi Minh City and the luxury resorts of Ha Long Bay are presented as the ultimate proof of a nation that has moved on. But there is a geographic truth that the tourism boards and diplomatic cables have agreed to ignore. Right now, 21% of this entire country is a live, metallic minefield. This isn't a metaphor for historical trauma. It is a literal, physical occupation of the earth. Over 5.6 million hectares of Vietnamese soil are currently infested with unexploded ordnance. To understand the weight of that, you have to realize that for 100 million people, peace is a surface-level illusion. Every time a farmer in the Central Highlands presses a shovel into the dirt, or a child in a rural village picks up a rusted yellow object, they are re-entering a conflict that was supposed to have ended 5 decades ago. We have been told this is a country of renewal. The investigation we are conducting today reveals it is actually a country under a 100-year siege, where the enemy isn't a soldier, but the very ground itself. We are investigating a nation where the war didn't stop, it simply went into the soil to wait. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know exactly how far these hidden stories are reaching. When you look at a map of modern Southeast Asia, you see borders, trade routes, and expanding urban grids. But the investigative layer we are uncovering reveals a different kind of geometry, the geometry of a calculated, permanent failure. To understand why the ground in Vietnam is still a live weapon, we have to look at the specific engineering of the Blue 26 cluster munition. In military circles, they were nicknamed guava bomblets because of their size and shape. During the height of the conflict, these were not dropped in dozens, but in the millions. Each mother bomb would break open in mid-air, scattering hundreds of these steel spheres across the jungle canopy and rice paddies like a lethal hailstorm. The official military narrative is that these weapons were designed to detonate on impact. But the data from the Technology Center for Unexploded Ordnance, UXO, tells a story of deliberate or indifferent failure. Up to 30% of these munitions did not explode. This 30% failure rate isn't a technical glitch, it is the foundation of the trap. A weapon that explodes immediately kills a soldier today. A weapon that fails to explode occupies the land for a century. Because they are small, aerodynamic, and often rusted to a dull yellow or earth-tone brown, they don't look like artifacts of war. They look like stones. They look like scrap metal. They look like something a curious 10-year-old would pick up in the tall grass of Quang Tri province. The geometry here is simple and devastating. The more failures there are, the more the geography itself becomes a prison. We are documenting a landscape where the architecture of the weapon was designed to outlive the soldiers who dropped it. This is how you turn a country's most fertile soil into a dead zone without ever firing a second shot. To grasp the magnitude of the secret war, we have to move beyond the internal maps of Southeast Asia and look at the global history of aerial violence. The official numbers provided by military historians and demoning NGOs like Project Renew reveal a statistical anomaly that defies conventional logic. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 5 million tons of ordnance on Vietnam. For the average viewer, 5 million tons is an abstract figure. But for an investigator, this is a direct indictment of the scale of the saturation. This is double the total tonnage dropped by the entire U.S. Air Force across every theater of World War II. Think about that. Every bomb dropped on Nazi Germany, every strike across the Pacific, every mission over occupied Europe, all of it, combined, represents only half of what was concentrated onto this single, narrow strip of Earth. The investigation into this tonnage paradox reveals that the war wasn't just about tactical objectives, it was an exercise in geographical erasure. We are looking at a location where the sheer density of metal in the soil has altered the magnetic and physical composition of the land. In Quang Tri province, the most heavily bombed slice of Earth in human history, the saturation reached a point where the soil itself was pulverized into a fine, metallic dust. What the official records never fully addressed is why this level of force was deemed necessary for a limited conflict. By doubling the weight of World War II's destruction on a country roughly the size of Norway, the goal shifted from defeating an army to permanently disabling a geography. We are uncovering a reality where the secret war was a biological experiment in how much high-explosive trauma a single ecosystem could absorb before it simply ceased to function. This is the math of death. It is a calculation where the variables are steel and soil, and the result is a country that is physically heavier today than it was 60 years ago, weighted down by 5 million tons of unexploded intent. What we are uncovering is not a temporary hazard, it is a geographic sentence. When we look at the pace of modern clearance, the official timeline for a safe Vietnam collapses. Government reports and international demoning organizations confirm a terrifying projection. At the current rate of global funding and local effort, it will take over 100 years to fully purge the Vietnamese countryside of unexploded ordnance. This means that for the next century, the map of Vietnam is a map of a country that is physically arrested. The economic miracle you see in the skyline of Ho Chi Minh City is happening on a foundation of live metal. We are investigating a nation where development is dictated not by urban planning, but by where it is safe to walk. Think about the psychological weight of that. For 100 years, the people of the Central Highlands are living in a landscape where the war didn't end, it simply changed its tempo. It went from a loud, visible conflict to a quiet, subterranean siege that claims new victims every single month. This is the geographic sentence. It is a reality where a farmer cannot expand his field, a village cannot build a new school, and a province cannot lay a new road without first conducting a high-stakes archaeological dig for death. The hidden side of Vietnam is that the war is still winning. It wins every time a hectare of land is left fallow because it is too expensive or too dangerous to clear. We are looking at a location where the earth itself has been turned into a state-sized prison, and the jailers are 5-decade-old fuses waiting for a single, misplaced footstep. To understand the geographic anomaly of Quang Tri, we have to look at a map of the 17th parallel. In 1954, an artificial line was drawn across this specific latitude, intended to be a temporary administrative boundary. Instead, it became the most volatile fault line on the planet. This narrow corridor, barely 100 kilometers wide, was designated as the demilitarized zone, but the reality was the exact opposite. Because this was the gateway between the north and the south, it became the focal point of a kinetic obsession that the world has never seen repeated. The investigation into military flight logs and ordnance manifests reveals that the density of explosives dropped here exceeds any other landmass in history. We are looking at a location where the concentration of metal per square meter is so high that it has effectively rewritten the local geology. In most parts of the world, soil is a living ecosystem of organic matter and minerals. In Quang Tri, the soil is a high-tensile mixture of laterite clay and weathered steel. This isn't a byproduct of the war, it is the physical remains of a decade-long attempt to turn a horizontal line on a map into an impassable vertical wall of fire. The result was a landscape where the very concept of ground was systematically dismantled, leaving behind a province that is more weapon than earth. The line of fire was not a random series of strikes, it was a mechanical doctrine of saturation. The objective was to create a white zone, a region where nothing could move, nothing could grow, and nothing could survive. To achieve this, military planners utilized a strategy of persistent bombardment that ignored the traditional boundaries of weather and terrain. During the monsoon seasons, when the jungle turned into a prehistoric swamp, the strikes did not stop, they intensified. The goal was to use the mud itself as a trap, burying munitions deep into the soft earth where they would remain hidden for decades. This is how the local climate was weaponized. By dropping high explosives into a saturated landscape, the ordnance didn't just explode, it migrated. The investigative data shows that thousands of tons of steel sank into the water table, creating a subterranean layer of hazards that move with the shifting groundwater. We are documenting a location where the geography was intentionally modified to be hostile to human life. The line of fire created a permanent chemical and physical barrier that remains active today. It is a mechanical legacy that transformed a fertile agricultural hub into a dead zone, proving that when you apply enough pressure to a specific coordinate, you don't just win a battle, you break the land's ability to support life for a century. The transformation of the soil in this region is a physical phenomenon that researchers are still trying to quantify. When 5 million tons of metal are introduced to a limited geography, the result is the pulverization of the earth. We are investigating a process where repeated high-heat explosions bake the iron-rich clay into a rock-hard substance that local farmers describe as impenetrable. The organic loam that once supported diverse crops was vaporized, replaced by a metallic slurry of shrapnel and chemical residue. This isn't just a layer of debris on top of the ground, it is a fundamental change in the soil's DNA. In the most heavily struck zones, the earth was turned over so many times by cratering charges that the natural drainage systems of the province were destroyed. What were once flowing streams and irrigation channels became stagnant, metal-lined craters that serve as breeding grounds for disease and remnants of toxicity. The investigation shows that the physical recovery of this land is not a matter of replanting trees, but of literal reconstruction. We are looking at a location where the earth was ground down to its most basic elements and then fused back together with the remnants of industrial violence. This pulverized earth is the most honest monument to the conflict, a silent, jagged landscape that refuses to return to its natural state, serving as a permanent record of the attempt to erase a civilization by destroying its foundation. The military logic that dictated the architecture of the demilitarized zone was a cold exercise in human erasure. Entire villages, some with histories stretching back 1,000 years, were identified as structural obstacles to the line of sight. The investigation into the 1960s reconnaissance maps reveals that towns were not just bombed, they were systematically removed from the grid. If a village sat on a strategic ridge or near a potential infiltration route, it was targeted for total clearing. This wasn't about the people inside, it was about the terrain they occupied. The goal was to create a clean landscape where sensors and long-range artillery could operate without visual interference. This forced a mass migration into the underworld, but for those who stayed on the surface, the architecture of their lives was dictated by the frequency of the strikes. We are uncovering a reality where the safe villages were only safe because they served as involuntary markers for the artillery batteries. The human consequence was a total loss of agency over one's own home. A house was no longer a dwelling, it was a coordinate in a fire control system. When we look at the ruins of these forgotten places today, we aren't just looking at war damage, we are looking at the deliberate dismantling of a society's geographic identity. The map was cleared to make room for a war that required the land to be empty, leaving behind a void where culture and community used to exist. 5 decades after the official ceasefire, the landscape of Quang Tri is defined by a specific acoustic and physical signature. Local inhabitants have developed a survival-based knowledge of the 50-year echo, the subtle signs that a live weapon is nearby. This isn't an academic study, it is a daily requirement for staying alive. They look for the way the grass grows over a buried crater, or the specific, hollow, sound the earth makes when stepped upon in certain areas. This is a location where the vibration of a passing truck can trigger a detonation from a weapon dropped before the driver was even born. The war is not a memory here, it is a frequency that the ground continues to broadcast. The physical signature of this danger is visible in the scars of the survivors and the stunted growth of the vegetation in red zones. We are investigating a phenomenon where the presence of unexploded metal dictates the movement of children, the placement of livestock, and the expansion of every family home. The investigation shows that the psychological toll of living within this echo is a form of chronic environmental stress that hasn't been addressed by the international community. Every metallic clink of a plow hitting a stone is a moment of potential catastrophe. This is the reality of a province where the silence of the countryside is a deception, and the echo of a forgotten war continues to dictate the rhythm of human existence. The cartography of the wound is the most difficult map to draw, because it changes with every monsoon. In provinces like Quang Nai and Quang Tri, the state has identified specific red zones, areas so heavily contaminated that they are officially off-limits for development. But the investigative reality is that these boundaries are fluid. Erosion and flooding move the unexploded ordnance, turning safe paths into lethal traps overnight. We are mapping a location where the danger is mobile. The concentration of metal in these zones is so high that traditional magnetic sensors are often overwhelmed, creating blind spots where demining teams cannot accurately clear the land. This cartography is a barrier to the future. These zones often coincide with the most fertile river valleys or the most strategic trade corridors, effectively paralyzing the economic potential of the region. The investigation reveals that the economic miracle of the city stops at the edge of these metallic maps. For the people living on the periphery, the red zone is not just a line on a government document, it is a physical wall that prevents them from accessing the resources they need to survive. We are looking at a country that is bifurcated, one side moving toward a high-tech future, and the other trapped within a cartography of violence that refuses to be erased. The wound is not healing, it is being managed, while the truth of the scale remains buried beneath the mud. To understand the geography of the Central Highlands, one must first confront the fertility paradox. This region is home to some of the most productive volcanic soil on the continent, a dark, nutrient-dense earth that should, by all rights, be the engine of the national economy. But for the people living here, the richness of the land is a trap. The investigation into the strike patterns of the late 1960s shows that the most arable valleys were precisely the areas designated as free fire zones. Because these regions provided the best cover and the most sustainable resources for movement, they were saturated with a density of explosives that defies modern agricultural recovery. We are looking at a location where the choice to feed a family is a literal gamble with mortality. A farmer in this region does not simply till the soil, he conducts a high-stakes search for metal. If he chooses the most fertile plot, he increases his yield but exponentially raises the probability of a detonation. If he chooses the safer, rocky highlands, he faces the slow death of malnutrition and poverty. This is not a historical observation, it is a contemporary economic reality. The data suggests that thousands of hectares of the best land in the country remain fallow because the cost of clearing the soil exceeds the value of the crop. The soil is ready to give life, but it is currently holding a century of stored violence that makes the harvest a game of chance where the house always wins. The investigation into the hardware of this gamble leads to a specific, plastic-cased weapon, the M14 mine, better known in military circles as the toe popper. Unlike the massive bombs dropped from the stratosphere, the M14 is small, light, and almost entirely non-metallic, making it a nightmare for modern demining teams to locate. Its design is a masterclass in cruel efficiency. It was never intended to kill the person who stepped on it. Instead, the objective was to maim, specifically to shatter the foot or the lower leg. The logic was that a dead soldier is a single casualty, but a wounded one requires two others to carry him and a massive logistical tail to treat him. In the civilian context of the Central Highlands, this military logic has mutated into a permanent economic burden. When a farmer strikes an M14, he does not just lose a limb, he loses his ability to provide, turning him into a lifelong dependent in a region with no social safety net. We are documenting a weapon that continues to execute its original mission 50 years after the soldiers left. It is a device that transforms a productive human being into a living monument of a forgotten conflict. The toe popper is the ultimate tool of geographic paralysis, ensuring that the people who live on this land are always one step away from a catastrophe that will bankrupt their family for generations. In the rural districts of provinces like Kon Tum, the geometry of survival has forced the population into a state of cognitive dissonance. There are official markers, red signs with a skull and crossbones, that designate certain fields as lethal zones. But when a family has no other source of income, these markers become invisible. The investigation reveals that the pressure of absolute poverty is more immediate than the threat of a hidden explosion. We are looking at a reality where parents send their children into the high grass to forage, knowing the risks, because the alternative is a certainty of hunger. This is the psychological war of attrition that defines the Central Highlands. It is a daily erosion of the human spirit. Every morning, thousands of people step into their fields with the knowledge that the ground beneath them is inconsistent. They have developed a local science for this survival, watching the way the rainwater pools or the way the weeds grow to guess where a mine might have shifted in the mud. But even the most experienced eyes cannot see through 6 inches of red clay. The human consequence is a society living in a state of permanent, low-level terror, where the act of walking to a neighboring village or clearing a new patch of brush is a calculated risk that no one in a developed nation would ever be asked to take. While most people see unexploded ordnance as a threat to be avoided, the investigation has uncovered an underground economy where it is treated as a resource. For the poorest inhabitants of the Highlands, the scrap metal gamble is the only way to bridge the gap between harvests. Equipped with primitive, homemade metal detectors, men and boys scour the forests for the remains of the conflict. They are looking for the heavy steel casings of large bombs or the aluminum fins of rockets, which can be sold to local dealers for a few dollars. It is a form of scavenging that carries a nearly 100% risk of injury over time. This isn't just about steel, it is about the desperation that drives a person to attempt to defuse a live 500-pound bomb with a hammer and a chisel just to get to the explosives inside. The explosives themselves are often sold to illegal fishing operations, creating a secondary cycle of environmental destruction. We are documenting a location where the remnants of war have been integrated into the very fabric of the local market. The hidden side of this economy is that the international community often counts these victims as accidents, but an investigator sees them as the inevitable result of a trade forced by systemic neglect. The land is being cleared, but it is being cleared by the hands of the hungry, one dangerous fragment at a time. The physical injury caused by a detonation is only the beginning of a much longer investigation into the dead of the maimed. In the rural provinces of Vietnam, the cost of an amputation and the subsequent prosthetic is often triple the annual income of a farming family. Because there is no comprehensive state insurance for these post-war victims, they are forced into the hands of informal moneylenders. We are uncovering a direct link between the geography of the minefields and the geography of chronic indebtedness. A single explosion doesn't just tear through flesh, it tears through the financial future of an entire lineage. In districts like Aloy, the investigation has found families who are still paying off the medical debts of a grandfather who stepped on a mine in the 1990s. The high interest rates on these loans mean that the family can never save enough to move away from the contaminated land, trapping them in a cycle of proximity to the very danger that ruined them. This is the debt of the maimed, a financial shackle that ensures the poorest victims of the conflict remain the most vulnerable. The human consequence is a population that is physically and economically anchored to a lethal landscape, unable to escape the gravity of a war that refuses to stop taking from them. The investigation concludes in the silent fields of the Highlands, vast stretches of land that should be teeming with life but are instead held in a state of forced preservation. This is the phenomenon of agricultural stagnation. When the threat of unexploded remnants reaches a certain density, the land becomes a non-place. It cannot be used for roads, it cannot host power lines, and it certainly cannot support the intensive coffee and rubber plantations that drive the rest of the nation's growth. The region is effectively frozen in time, a geographic vacuum in the middle of a booming country. This silence is not peaceful, it is an indictment. It represents the billions of dollars in lost potential and the millions of lives that have been stunted by the presence of a 5-decade-old fuse. We are looking at a country that is sprinting toward the future with one leg caught in a trap. The economic irony of death is that the more the rest of Vietnam develops, the further behind these silent fields fall. The gap between the neon lights of the city and the red clay of the Highlands is getting wider, and the bridge between them is buried under 5 million tons of unexploded metal. The investigation shows that until the ground is cleared, the war is still the primary architect of the region's destiny. To understand the industrial design of the Blue 26, we have to look past the military utility and analyze its physical aesthetic. Each of these submunitions is a sphere, approximately the size of an orange or a large guava, cast from heavy steel. The surface is not smooth, it is covered in hundreds of tiny, raised steel pellets designed to fragment into thousands of shards upon detonation. But after 5 decades in the red clay of the Highlands, the oxidation process transforms these weapons. The jagged edges soften, and the steel takes on a textured, organic appearance. In the eyes of an investigator, this is a masterpiece of unintentional camouflage. To a person who has never seen a technical manual, these objects do not broadcast a warning. They look like a natural part of the forest floor or a discarded piece of machinery. The investigative reality is that the size and shape of these weapons are their most lethal features in a post-conflict era. There is no large casing, no long tail fin, and no obvious fuse to signal a threat. Instead, you have a compact, tactile object that fits perfectly into the palm of a hand. We are looking at a location where the most dangerous items in the environment have been engineered to be the most portable. This is not a failure of design, it is the physical manifestation of a weapon that was meant to be dropped in the millions and left to saturate the earth. The aesthetic of the Blue 26 ensures that it remains hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment an unsuspecting hand closes around its weathered, metallic ribs. The aerodynamic properties of the Blue 26 were engineered to ensure a wide, even dispersal from the parent canister. To achieve this, each sphere is equipped with curved ridges or fins that cause the munition to spin rapidly as it falls through the atmosphere. This centrifugal force is what arms the internal firing pin. But once the weapon hits the soft mud or dense jungle canopy and fails to explode, these fins serve a secondary, more deceptive purpose. They give the object a mechanical, toy-like appearance. In the decades since the war, these yellow rings and ribbed spheres have become a curiosity in rural villages. The investigation into survivor testimonies reveals a recurring theme: the victims were drawn to the object because of its unique, symmetrical shape. This is the aerodynamic mirage. A weapon that was designed to utilize the laws of physics for maximum coverage now utilizes the human instinct for pattern recognition to attract attention. We are documenting a landscape where the artifacts of a high-tech conflict have become indistinguishable from debris. Because they are often found in clusters, they create a honeypot effect, where one found object leads to the discovery of several more, increasing the probability of a multi-casualty event. The engineering that allowed these weapons to glide gracefully through the air 50 years ago is the same engineering that makes them irresistible to the untrained eye today. The fins are no longer flight stabilizers, they are the jagged edges of a trap that has been waiting half a century to be sprung. The data-driven investigation into the casualties of unexploded ordnance reveals a chilling demographic shift. While the war was fought by soldiers, the post-war era is being endured by children. Statistics from groups like the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange and local demoning NGOs show that approximately 1/3 of all deaths and injuries since 1975 have involved minors. This is not an accident of geography, it is a direct consequence of the physical properties we have just analyzed. A 10-year-old walking to school or playing in the fields is naturally inclined to explore. To a child, a rusted metal sphere is not a 500-gram explosive charge, it is a marble, a ball, or a piece of scrap that can be traded for a few cents. We are looking at a location where the playground is a live fire zone. The investigation shows that the highest concentration of child casualties occurs in the late afternoon, when children are unsupervised and moving through the outskirts of their villages. The human consequence of this 33% statistic is a generation that is being physically dismantled before it reaches adulthood. In provinces like Quang Binh, there are entire school districts where the presence of prosthetic limbs is a common sight. This is the playground of remnants, a reality where the curiosity of youth is met with the industrial violence of a previous century. The weapons are not just taking lives, they are targeting the very future of the Vietnamese population, ensuring that the scars of the conflict are refreshed every time a child reaches into the grass. The fatal curiosity of a child is perhaps the most effective delivery system these weapons have ever had. In rural Vietnam, where toys are a luxury and the environment is the primary source of entertainment, the discovery of something new in the dirt is a significant event. The investigation into the mechanics of these accidents reveals that the detonation rarely happens upon the first touch. Often, a child will carry the munition for hours, showing it to friends or attempting to pry it open to see what is inside. This delay is what makes the eventual explosion so devastating, as it often occurs in a crowded area or inside a family home. This is the weaponization of the human spirit. The very instincts that drive a child to learn and interact with their world, touch, inspection, and play, are the triggers for their destruction. We are documenting a psychological landscape where parents must teach their children to be afraid of the earth. This is a total inversion of the natural order. Instead of the land being a source of security and growth, it is a source of sudden, randomized trauma. The fatal curiosity is a cycle that cannot be broken by traditional education alone, because as long as the ground remains saturated with millions of these toys, the law of averages will continue to claim the most inquisitive minds of the next generation. The investigation proves that the war is not over as long as a child's natural impulse to play remains a death sentence. The long-term human consequence of this ongoing trauma is the creation of a generation of the void. We are not just talking about the physical loss of limbs or eyes, we are investigating the erasure of potential. When a child is maimed by a cluster munition, their path through life is permanently altered. In the agrarian society of rural Vietnam, physical labor is the primary currency. A person who cannot work the fields is often seen as a burden, leading to a profound sense of isolation and a loss of physical agency. The investigation into the social fabric of these villages reveals a hidden layer of depression and economic stagnation among the youth who have survived these encounters. This generation is a living record of a conflict they never witnessed. They carry the remnants in their bodies and in their families' financial ledgers. We are looking at a location where the youth population is bifurcated between those who can participate in the modern economy and those who are trapped by the legacy of the yellow ring. The degeneration of the void is a testament to the fact that the war did not just end in 1975, it simply mutated into a form that requires no soldiers to continue its mission. The investigation arrives at a heavy truth. For these children, the world is not a place of infinite possibility, but a narrow, dangerous corridor where one mistake can lead to a lifetime of silence. The miracle of Vietnam's growth is a surface-level story that ignores the hollowed-out lives of those who were sacrificed to the soil. To understand the scale of the molecular occupation, we must look at the aerial logs from 1961 to 1971. During this decade, the sky over South Vietnam was the staging ground for a tactical deployment of approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides. The official military objective was recorded as cover stripping, a mechanical process to remove the dense jungle canopy that shielded the movement of opposing forces. But the investigation into the chemical composition of these agents reveals a transition from a simple weed killer to a permanent environmental poison. We are looking at a location where the air was used as a delivery system for a total ecological overhaul. The most notorious of these chemicals was Agent Orange, a mixture that was inadvertently, or perhaps indifferently, contaminated with one of the most toxic substances known to science. The investigation shows that this was not a localized event, it was a saturation that covered 10% of the entire landmass of South Vietnam. In provinces like Quang Nai and Binh Dinh, the frequency of these flights meant that the jungle was not just dying, it was being marinated in a synthetic compound that was never designed to exit the ecosystem. This was the birth of the molecular occupation, a reality where the war moved from the visible destruction of buildings and bridges into the invisible structure of the soil. The aerial harvest was not a harvest of crops, but a seeding of a chemical legacy that would outlast the government that authorized its use. At the center of this investigation is a single molecule, 2,3,7,8-tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD. This is the forensic signature of the conflict, a substance so potent that it is measured in parts per trillion. To grasp the severity, an investigator must realize that TCDD is not a natural occurrence, it is a byproduct of a rushed industrial manufacturing process. It is the most toxic form of dioxin ever studied by the scientific community. When these millions of gallons hit the forest floor, the TCDD did not evaporate. It is a lipophilic compound, meaning it binds with extreme tenacity to organic matter and fats. We are investigating a substance that is virtually indestructible in a natural environment. It does not dissolve in water and it resists the ultraviolet degradation of the tropical sun. Once it entered the Vietnamese geography, it established a permanent residency. The TCDD signature is now a part of the baseline reality for millions of people. It has a half-life in the human body of 7 to 11 years, but in the anaerobic conditions of lake sediment and deep soil, that timeline stretches into many decades. This is the persistence of poison. We are documenting a location where the weapons of the 1960s have achieved a form of chemical immortality, remaining just as lethal today as they were when they first exited the spray nozzles of a C-123 provider. This is the molecular truth that contradicts every claim of environmental recovery. The investigation into the movement of these toxins leads us directly into the hydrological systems of the region. Vietnam is a land defined by its water, the monsoons, the rice paddies, and the sprawling network of the Mekong Delta. But for the molecular occupation, these water systems acted as a global delivery mechanism. While the chemicals were sprayed onto the leaves of the jungle, the heavy tropical rains washed the dioxin into the soil and eventually into the sediment of the riverbeds. This is the hydrological migration. The poison did not stay where it was dropped, it followed the gravity of the landscape. We are looking at a geographic phenomenon where the very lifeblood of the country, its water, became a carrier for its destruction. The investigation shows that the dioxin concentrated in the silt of low-lying areas, creating subterranean reservoirs of toxicity. During the flood seasons, this contaminated sediment is redistributed across the agricultural plains, ensuring that the molecular occupation is refreshed and expanded with every passing year. This movement makes the task of containment nearly impossible. The river systems have effectively decentralized the crime, moving the evidence from the remote mountain ridges into the heart of the most populated farming communities. This hydrological reality means that no map of the original spray zones is truly accurate today. The poison has rewritten its own borders, flowing wherever the water dictates. The bioaccumulation trap is where the molecular occupation meets the dinner table of the rural population. Because TCDD binds to fats, it does not simply pass through an ecosystem, it climbs it. The investigation has traced the path of the dioxin from the river sediment into the microscopic organisms, then into the fish, and finally into the ducks that are a staple of the Vietnamese diet. By the time it reaches the top of the food chain, the human being, the concentration of the toxin has been amplified thousands of times. This is a location where the environment has been turned into a slow-motion delivery system for a DNA-altering substance. In rural villages near former air bases, the act of eating is a form of exposure. The investigation into local livestock shows that even in 2026, the fatty tissues of animals raised in these zones contain levels of TCDD that would trigger a national emergency in any developed nation. But for the people here, there is no alternative. Their economy is based on what the land and water provide. They are trapped in a biological loop where their primary source of nutrition is also their primary source of genetic damage. This bioaccumulation trap is the most insidious layer of the investigation. It proves that the war is not being fought with bullets, but with the very nutrients that are supposed to sustain life. The hidden side of the economic miracle is a population that is being chemically hollowed out by the very food they labor to produce. The most devastating human consequence of this chemical persistence is found in the breast milk index. The investigation has documented a horrifying reality in the specialized wards of provincial hospitals. Mothers who were born long after the war ended are passing high concentrations of TCDD to their infants through nursing. This is the point where the act of nurturing becomes a transmission of toxicity. The dioxin that has spent 40 years migrating through the soil and the food chain eventually finds its way into the human reproductive system, where it is stored in the mother's fat cells and released during lactation. This is the ultimate erasure of the boundary between the past and the future. We are looking at a medical phenomenon where the war is being inherited as a biological birthright. The investigation shows that the concentration of dioxin in the breast milk of women in hotspot regions is dozens of times higher than the World Health Organization's safety limits. The human cost is a generation of infants who are exposed to a potent endocrine disruptor from their very first breath. This is not a health crisis, it is a transgenerational sentence. The Breast Milk Index is a forensic ledger that records the true duration of the conflict, a war that is currently being fought inside the bodies of children who have never seen a battlefield, but whose very cells are being rewritten by the molecular remnants of their grandparents' era. The investigation must conclude by challenging the persistence of the lie, the official narrative that suggested these herbicides would naturally degrade and disappear. For decades, the manufacturers and the governments involved claimed that the tropical heat and high humidity of Vietnam would accelerate the breakdown of Agent Orange, rendering it harmless within weeks of application. But the data we have uncovered from firms like Hatfield Consultants proves the opposite. In the anaerobic environments of the Vietnamese wetlands, the TCDD has proven to be one of the most stable synthetic compounds ever created. It did not go away, it simply changed its address. This lie served a specific geopolitical purpose. It allowed for the normalization of relations without the normalization of the environment. By pretending the poison had diluted, the international community could ignore the growing list of birth defects and cancers that define life in the spray zones. We are looking at a location where the truth has been buried under a layer of diplomatic convenience. The molecular occupation is real, it is measurable, and it is ongoing. The investigation confirms that the persistence of poison is matched only by the persistence of the refusal to acknowledge it. Until the molecular reality is addressed with the same urgency as the economic growth, the side you've never seen will remain a place where the air, the water, and the very blood of the people are still occupied by an enemy that refuses to retreat. To understand the perimeter of denial, we must look at the specific coordinates of former U.S. airbases like Da Nang and Bien Hoa. For decades, these locations were presented as success stories of post-war reconstruction, hubs of civilian aviation and symbols of a modern, connected Vietnam. But the investigative reality is that these perimeters contain some of the most concentrated zones of industrial toxicity on the planet. This is the birth of the hotspot. While the 19 million gallons of herbicides were spread across the jungle, the airbases were the epicenters of the supply chain. These were the sites of bulk storage, mixing, and loading. The official narrative suggested that once the spraying stopped, the environmental threat would dilute into the atmosphere. The investigation into the soil chemistry proves that the exact opposite occurred. We are looking at a location where the poison did not dilute, it pooled. The perimeter of these bases acted as a containment vessel for accidental spills and deliberate drainage that occurred during a decade of high-tempo operations. Because the dioxin TCDD binds so aggressively to the clay and sediment of the Vietnamese landscape, it created a subterranean lens of contamination that stays exactly where it fell. This is the perimeter of denial, a geographic reality where the ground inside the fence is fundamentally different from the ground outside. For 50 years, the truth of these hotspots was managed as a sensitive administrative secret, shielded by the busy noise of the commercial airports that now sit on top of them. The investigation shows that the miracle of these transportation hubs is a surface-level illusion, masking a soil concentration that remains an active, localized apocalypse. The investigation into the spillage records of Bien Hoa reveals a history of storage failures that the official military logs sought to minimize. Bien Hoa was the primary storage facility for the herbicides used in Operation Ranch Hand, housing thousands of 55-gallon drums at any given time. We are uncovering documented incidents where these drums, exposed to the intense tropical heat and monsoons, corroded and leaked directly into the unmined soil. One specific event in 1970 involved the accidental discharge of thousands of gallons of concentrated Agent Orange into the base's drainage system. This wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a logistical catastrophe that was never fully remediated before the base changed hands in 1975. These leaks created what investigators call source zones. Instead of the diluted parts per trillion concentrations found in the jungle, the soil at Bien Hoa reached levels that are physiologically incomprehensible. The investigation into the drainage maps shows that these spills followed the natural slope of the base toward the Dong Nai River watershed. We are documenting a location where the lack of environmental oversight during the conflict created a permanent chemical reservoir. The spillage records are the forensic blueprint for the current crisis. They proved that the contamination of the surrounding community was not an unavoidable consequence of war, but a direct result of the negligent handling of a substance that the manufacturers knew was unstable. The ground at Bien Hoa is not just polluted, it is a saturated archive of every leak, spill, and drainage failure that occurred during a decade of chemical warfare. The Hatfield exposure is the moment that dilution lie finally collapsed under the weight of independent forensic data. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators from Hatfield Consultants and the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange conducted a series of soil and sediment tests that the international community could no longer ignore. Their findings in Da Nang and Bien Hoa were staggering. In certain areas of the former mixing sites, the concentration of TCDD was measured at over 300 times the international safety limit for residential soil. This is the data that officially designated these airbases as hotspots, locations where the chemical signature was so high it posed an immediate threat to human life. This forensic look at the soil revealed that the dioxin had not migrated more than a few centimeters into the deep clay, but it had remained perfectly preserved in the surface layers where human contact is most likely. The investigation proved that the persistence of poison was a localized reality that challenged every diplomatic attempt to downplay the legacy of the conflict. The Hatfield exposure stripped away the narrative of environmental recovery and forced the realization that the side you've never seen is a place where the dirt itself is a toxic waste category. These soil concentrations are not just numbers in a report, they are the geographic proof that the war is still being waged at a molecular level against anyone who steps onto that specific coordinate of the Vietnamese map. The watershed betrayal is the mechanism by which the localized toxins of the airbases escaped their perimeters and entered the bodies of the surrounding civilian population. While the bases were fenced off, the water was not. The investigation into the topography of the Bien Hoa hotspot reveals that the contaminated soil was continuously eroded by the monsoons, washing into the local ponds and lakes where the community fished and raised livestock. This is a geographic crime that moved with the rain. The dioxin was carried into the Bien Hung Lake and the local tributaries, where it settled into the fat cells of the ducks and the sediment-dwelling fish that are the primary protein source for the local poor. We are mapping a reality where the geography of the base dictated the biology of the neighborhood. The investigation has documented families living on the edge of the fence line who have consumed these watershed products for generations. They were never told that the fish they caught or the water they used for their gardens was a delivery system for a DNA-altering substance. The watershed betrayal is a direct challenge to the idea that environmental hazards can be contained by a chain-link fence. The poison followed the path of least resistance, migrating through the water table and the food chain until it reached the households of people who had nothing to do with the airbase's operations. This is the hidden truth of the hotspot. The base is the source, but the entire ecosystem is the victim, turning the local landscape into a silent, chemical siege. The fenced reality is the human consequence of living on the edge of a localized apocalypse. For the thousands of families residing in the shadow of Da Nang and Bien Hoa, the fence line is the only barrier between a normal life and a genetic sentence. The investigation has traced the health records of people in these neighborhoods, uncovering a disproportionate rate of severe physical deformities, rare cancers, and reproductive failures. This is the medical fallout of the hotspot. The people living here are the investigative subjects of a chemical experiment they never volunteered for. They occupy a landscape where the value of their property and the safety of their children are determined by a laboratory report they often cannot read. We are looking at a location where the airbase is a daily reminder of a lingering threat. The psychological toll of the fenced reality is a form of environmental trauma that has no expiration date. The families are trapped, they cannot afford to leave, yet they know that every time their children play in the dirt or eat local produce, they are courting a catastrophe. This is the human consequence of Pillar 3, the deliberate erasure of the truth in favor of trade alliances. The hotspot conspiracy was maintained for as long as possible because acknowledging the fenced reality meant acknowledging a liability that no one wanted to pay. For the people of Bien Hoa, the war is a physical presence that sits across the street, leaking into their soil and their lives with every drop of rain. The decontamination myth is the final layer of the investigation, challenging the 2026 cleanup narrative that suggests the problem is being solved. While there have been high-profile US-led remediation projects in Da Nang, the investigation into the sheer volume of contaminated soil at Bien Hoa reveals a far darker truth. Bien Hoa is several times larger and more complex than Da Nang, with an estimated 500,000 cubic meters of soil that remains untreated. This is a volume of toxicity that defies current technical and financial capacity. The cleanup is often a matter of containment, digging up the dirt and burying it in massive, concrete-lined landfill cells rather than actually destroying the TCDD molecule. We are investigating a location where the solution is effectively a high-tech coffin for the Earth. This is the myth, that once the soil is moved, the threat is gone. In reality, these landfill sites will require monitoring and maintenance for centuries to prevent the liners from leaking back into the watershed. The investigation shows that the economic miracle cannot outrun the chemical reality of these airbases. The decontamination efforts, while significant, are a drop of water in an ocean of poison. The side you've never seen is a country that is physically storing its own toxicity in massive, industrial tombs, hoping that the next generation will find a way to finish a job that the current one cannot afford to complete. The hotspot is not gone, it is simply being reshaped into a different kind of geographic burden. The investigation into the molecular legacy of the conflict has reached a point where we must look beyond the soil and into the human genome. For decades, the understanding of chemical damage was limited to those who were directly exposed to the spray. But the forensic data now points to a much longer timeline. We are uncovering the mechanics of the epigenetic clock, a biological process where the trauma of the environment is encoded into the chemical switches that control our genes. This is the transition from a simple exposure to a permanent inheritance. The dioxin TCDD does not just damage the person it touches, it alters the instructions that are passed down to their children and grandchildren. We are looking at a location where the war has achieved a form of biological immortality. The investigation shows that the epigenetic changes triggered by dioxin exposure are persistent, surviving through the third and even the fourth generation. This is not a matter of a child being born with a toxin in their blood, it is a matter of a child being born with a corrupted set of genetic instructions. The clock was started in the 1960s, but it is still ticking in the maternity wards of 2026. This is the ultimate, hidden side of the conflict, a reality where the map of the spray zones has been folded into the double helix of the Vietnamese people. The epigenetic clock ensures that the war remains a contemporary event, regardless of how many decades have passed since the last plane returned to base. To understand the corrupted chromosome, we must look at the specific way TCDD functions as an endocrine disruptor. This molecule is a biological imposter. It enters the human cell and binds to the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, a protein that regulates the expression of a vast array of genes. Once bound, the dioxin essentially hijacks the cell's operating system, forcing it to read the genetic code incorrectly. The investigation into the medical records of provinces like Quang Ngai reveals a pattern of developmental failures that can be traced back to this microscopic interference. We are documenting a forensic reality where the poison is not just killing cells, but rewriting them. The human consequence of this corrupted chromosome is a direct challenge to our understanding of a post-war environment. When the genetic instructions for building a limb or a spine are altered by a chemical remnant, the result is a birth defect that occurs 50 years after the tactical mission was completed. This is the permanent war inside human cells. We are looking at a population where the very blueprints of life have been compromised. The investigation shows that these chromosomal errors are not randomized, they cluster in the same geographic regions where the soil concentrations of TCDD remain at their peak. This is the biological evidence of a crime that refuses to be buried. The corrupted chromosome is a record of a chemical weapon that continues to execute its original mission, targeting the development of infants who were never part of the original conflict. The investigation leads us into the specialized wards of Long Hoa Ben, or peace villages. These facilities are the primary documentation centers for the physical cost of the molecular occupation. Inside, we find thousands of young Vietnamese who represent the third and fourth generation of victims. The records kept by the doctors here are a chilling index of the war's endurance. They document children born with severe physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and missing limbs, conditions that the international medical community recognizes as the clinical signature of dioxin exposure. These are not accidents of nature, they are the medical fallout of a century-long chemical siege. We are documenting a reality where the peace village is a misnomer. These are sites of an ongoing medical struggle where the weapons are corrupted chromosomes and the casualties are the most vulnerable members of society. The investigation reveals that the parents of these children are often poor farmers who were born years after the spraying ended, yet they are the ones who must carry the burden of specialized care that they cannot afford. Long Hoa Ben is the geographic point where the economic miracle of Vietnam hits a wall of biological reality. The records here prove that the war is not a historical event to be studied, it is a living, breathing medical emergency that requires a permanent infrastructure of support. The Peace Village is a witness to a genocide in slow motion, where the weapon is a molecule that has become a permanent feature of the national landscape. The generation of echoes is defined by specific medical anomalies that have become common in the hotspot regions. The investigation has focused on the prevalence of spina bifida and limb deformities among the youth of these provinces. These conditions are not just medical statistics, they are the physical echoes of the 19 million gallons of herbicides dropped half a century ago. We are uncovering a pattern where the third and fourth generations are suffering from the same severe health issues that afflicted the original survivors. This is a location where the echo of the war is louder than the original strike. The investigation into the medical history of these families shows a recurring cycle of reproductive failure. We are documenting a human consequence where the desire to start a family is met with the fear of a genetic sentence. The generation of echoes is a population that lives with the knowledge that their own bodies may be carrying a lethal legacy. In rural districts, the presence of these deformities has created a unique social geography, where certain villages are marked by the visible scars of a conflict they never fought. The investigation proves that the war is currently being waged in the specialized wards of hospitals, where the casualties are infants who are born into a world where their very existence is a testament to a chemical crime that has never been resolved. The echo is not fading, it is being amplified by the passage of time and the persistence of the toxin in the environment. The maternal paradox is the most agonizing layer of the investigation. In a natural world, the mother's body is designed to be a fortress for the developing child, filtering out hazards and providing the nutrients required for growth. But in the molecularly occupied zones of Vietnam, this biological protection has been inverted. Because TCDD is stored in the mother's fat cells, it is passed directly to the child during pregnancy and later through breast milk. The very act of nurturing, the biological commitment to protect the next generation, becomes the mechanism for their exposure. This is the human consequence of a biological sentence that is passed through the cells that are supposed to protect life. We are looking at a reality where the bond between mother and child has been weaponized by a chemical leftover. The investigation into the breast milk of women in the Central Highlands shows that the concentration of dioxin is highest in those who live closest to the former spray zones. The maternal paradox ensures that the molecular occupation is self-perpetuating. Even if the soil were cleared today, the dioxin already stored in the bodies of the population would continue to migrate into the next generation. This is the hidden side of the medical crisis. The toxin has bypassed the environmental barriers and established itself within the human reproductive cycle. The investigation shows that the mother is both the victim and the involuntary carrier, trapped in a biological loop that was created by a decade of industrial violence. The investigation must conclude by dismantling the biological ceasefire myth, the idea that enough time has passed for the wounds of the war to heal. If we look only at the surface, the economic miracle and the demographic growth suggest a nation that has fully recovered. But the forensics of the fourth generation tell a different story. The war is currently being fought inside the bodies of infants who were born in 2026. There is no ceasefire in the genome. The corrupted chromosomes and the epigenetic switches do not respect peace treaties or trade agreements. They continue to operate according to the chemical logic that was established 60 years ago. This myth serves as a convenient shield for the manufacturers and the governments that deployed these chemicals. It allows them to treat the Agent Orange crisis as a legacy issue that will eventually fade away. But the investigation confirms that the crisis is expanding, not contracting. As the dioxin continues to accumulate in the food chain and migrate through the human reproductive system, the number of victims in the third and fourth generations continues to rise. We are documenting a location where the biological cost of the war is a debt that is still being collected with interest. The side you've never seen is a country where the most important investigation is not into the archives of the past, but into the specialized wards and peace villages, where the war is still claiming new casualties every single day. The ceasefire is an illusion, the molecular occupation is the reality. To understand the legal vacuum, we must examine the 1984 landmark settlement in the United States. 7 chemical manufacturers agreed to pay $180 million to veterans who claimed injuries from exposure to herbicides during the conflict. While this was a monumental admission of the potential for harm, it created a structural wall of exclusion. The settlement was designed as a class action that specifically defined the class as those who served in the American Armed Forces. By framing the resolution in this narrow category, the chemical firms effectively purchased a global shield. This was the birth of a sovereignty of settlement where the manufacturers could claim they had fulfilled their moral and financial obligations without ever addressing the 4 million Vietnamese people who lived in the spray zones. The investigation into the court records reveals a calculated effort to prevent a precedent that would allow the local population to seek similar redress. When the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange filed their own lawsuit in 2004, the case was dismissed on the grounds that the use of herbicides did not constitute a violation of international law at the time. We are looking at a location where the law has been used as a selective tool, providing a safety net for those who drop the chemicals while leaving those on the ground in a geographic and legal void. The 1984 settlement was not the beginning of justice, it was the construction of a barrier that has successfully isolated the manufacturers from the largest group of victims for 40 years. This is the reality of a global legal system that prioritizes the stability of industrial contracts over the biological restoration of an entire nation. The investigation into the double standard of science reveals a forensic irony that is difficult to ignore. The same medical data and the same epidemiological studies that have been used by the Department of Veterans Affairs to establish a list of presumptive conditions for compensation are systematically dismissed when applied to the Vietnamese population. For a Western veteran, a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes or certain rare cancers is legally accepted as a direct consequence of exposure. But for a farmer in the Central Highlands with the same diagnosis, the burden of proof is shifted back to the individual. They are told that their condition is a result of lifestyle, diet, or inconclusive environmental factors. This scientific bifurcation is a pillar of the legal vacuum. We are uncovering a reality where a molecule is only considered a weapon if it affects a specific passport holder. The investigation shows that by labeling the local health crisis as inconclusive, the international community has successfully deprioritized the need for a direct settlement. This isn't a failure of research, it is a strategic use of ambiguity to avoid a multi-billion-dollar liability. The medical data is clear, the soil concentrations are verified, and the birth defects are documented in the thousands. Yet, the legal framework requires a level of certainty for the Vietnamese victims that is never demanded of their Western counterparts. This double standard ensures that the biological cost of the war remains a private burden for the families of the victims, while the corporate entities that produced the chemicals continue to operate with a clean balance sheet. The pursuit of the Silicon Orient has created a geopolitical gag order that silences the demand for justice. As Vietnam emerges as the primary alternative to Chinese manufacturing, the priority of the state has shifted toward high-tech trade alliances and foreign direct investment. The investigation into recent diplomatic cables reveals that the issue of Agent Orange reparations is often treated as a legacy obstacle that must be managed rather than a demand for a settlement. To secure the infrastructure projects and the tech factory contracts that power the modern economy, the historical grievances of the rural poor have been placed on a secondary tier of importance. We are uncovering a reality where the economic miracle is being used as a trade-off for accountability. For the chemical manufacturers and the governments involved, the transition of Vietnam into a key strategic partner provides the perfect opportunity to let the clock run out on the victims. The investigation shows that as the trade volume between the former adversaries increases, the volume of the protest for reparations decreases. This is the price of a trade alliance. The neon lights of the new industrial zones are a mask for the legal vacuum that remains in the provinces. We are looking at a location where the future is being built on a foundation of deprioritized justice, ensuring that the 4 million people affected by the molecular occupation are seen as a cost of doing business rather than a human emergency that requires an immediate and direct resolution. The corporate shield is a masterclass in legal classification. During the investigation into the defense strategies of the chemical firms, we found a consistent effort to categorize Agent Orange as a tactical herbicide intended for vegetation control. By avoiding the label of a chemical weapon, the manufacturers have bypassed the most stringent international treaties and legal protections. They argue that they were simply following government specifications for a defoliant, shifting the liability entirely to the state. This legal maneuver creates a loop where no one is responsible for the dioxin TCDD, the government claims sovereign immunity, and the corporations claim they were just contractors. This shield is not just a defensive tactic, it is a proactive attempt to erase the intentionality of the crime. The investigation reveals that the manufacturers were aware of the high dioxin levels as early as the mid-1960s but did not alter their production methods because the tactical demand for the herbicide was too high. They prioritized the speed of delivery over the purity of the product. Today, that same corporate shield prevents the victims from accessing the profits of the firms that built their wealth on these tactical contracts. We are documenting a location where the law has been tailored to protect the industrial supply chain at the expense of human life. The corporate shield ensures that the manufacturers can continue to innovate in the global market while the people of the spray zones are left to pay the price for a chemical shortcut that was taken 60 years ago. The human consequence of the legal vacuum is the privatization of a war crime. Without a direct settlement or a comprehensive reparations fund from the manufacturers, the 4 million Vietnamese victims are forced to fund their own survival. This is the price of silence. The investigation has found that the vast majority of the Agent Orange children in rural districts are cared for by their aging parents, often in conditions of extreme poverty. They do not have access to the specialized prosthetics, the genetic therapy, or the environmental remediation that a multi-billion-dollar settlement would provide. Instead, they are left to rely on small government stipends and the occasional charity of NGOs. This lack of justice is a silent, domestic genocide. We are looking at a location where the erasure of potential is not just a physical reality, but a financial one. A family in the hotspot zones must choose between buying medicine for a maimed child or buying seeds for a contaminated field. The investigation confirms that the legal vacuum has created a permanent underclass, defined by their proximity to a chemical legacy that no one will own. This is the final verdict of the price of a trade alliance. The world moves forward, the factories open, and the trade agreements are signed, while the people who were sacrificed to the soil are left in the dark. The investigation shows that until there is a direct and transparent settlement, the side you've never seen will always be a place where justice is a luxury that the victims can no longer afford to wait for. To understand the subterranean anomaly of the Iron Triangle, we must first investigate the unique geology of the laterite clay. This is a soil rich in iron and aluminum, which, when exposed to air, undergoes a chemical transformation that turns it as hard as concrete. This was the foundation for a 250-kilometer network of hand-dug sanctuaries. The investigation into the construction methods reveals a staggering commitment to manual labor. Every meter of these tunnels was excavated using nothing but small hoes and wicker baskets to carry away the earth. The logic was simple: the surface was no longer a viable habitat. The only way to exist was to become part of the geology itself. This laterite vault was not just a hiding place, it was an engineering marvel that utilized the very properties of the earth to resist the most advanced weaponry of the 20th century. We are looking at a location where the soil provided a natural armor that could absorb the shockwaves of heavy ordnance. The investigation shows that the 250-kilometer network was a decentralized city, connecting villages and mountain ridges in a way that the military observers on the surface could never map. By using the natural hardening of the clay, the inhabitants created a permanent, self-sustaining architecture of resistance. This was the birth of the hollow geography, a reality where the true strength of the population was hidden beneath the red dust, invisible to the sensors and the cameras of the aerial patrols. The laterite was the silent partner in a decade of survival, proving that when the sky becomes a source of death, the earth is the only remaining sovereign territory. The first tier of the abyss, located approximately 3 meters below the surface, served as the combat skin of the network. This level was a forensic masterclass in tactical concealment and rapid movement. It was characterized by narrow, zigzagging corridors designed to neutralize the blast radius of grenades and to prevent a clear line of sight for any intruder who managed to find an entry point. The investigation into these tunnels reveals a series of trapdoors and dead ends that functioned as mechanical puzzles. If a passage was compromised, it could be sealed instantly with a layer of packed earth, isolating the breach while the rest of the system remained functional. This 3-meter level was also the primary site for the ventilation shafts and the firing points that allowed the inhabitants to strike at the surface and then vanish back into the clay. We are documenting a location where the interface between the human and the earth was a lethal threshold. The combat skin was the only part of the network that ever interacted with the outside world, and it was designed to be as deceptive as possible. Every root, every rock, and every mound of earth above this level was a potential observation post. The investigation shows that the first tier was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, creating a landscape where the ground itself felt alive and hostile. To walk over the Iron Triangle was to walk on a surface that was honeycombed with an invisible, subterranean military architecture that could open at any moment and swallow an entire squad without leaving a trace. Descending to the 6-meter level, we enter the domestic core of the abyss. This was the depth where the social fabric of the community was preserved in total darkness. The investigation into these mid-level chambers reveals a sophisticated organizational structure that mirrored the villages on the surface. Here, in the damp, lightless clay, people maintained hospitals, kitchens, schools, and even small manufacturing workshops. The heat was immense, and the air was thin, yet the investigative records show that thousands of people lived in these 6-meter vaults for months at a time. This was not a temporary refuge, it was a permanent, alternative civilization. In the kitchens, the inhabitants utilized a specialized smoke dispersion system that filtered the air through multiple chambers of soil before releasing it hundreds of meters away, making it impossible for aerial scouts to detect the heat or the smell of cooking. We are looking at a location where the most basic human needs, sustenance and education, were transformed into acts of clandestine engineering. The hospitals at this level were the sites of complex surgeries performed by the light of bicycle-powered generators. The investigation reveals that the domestic core was the heart of the resistance, ensuring that the population remained a cohesive unit even when their homes on the surface were being systematically erased. This 6-meter depth was the boundary between the tactical and the human, a place where life continued in defiance of the industrial violence occurring just a few meters above their heads. The 12-meter level was the final sanctuary, the ultimate refuge from the shockwaves of B-52 strikes. At this depth, the inhabitants were effectively immune to the carpet bombing that pulverized the surface. The investigation into these deep-tier tunnels reveals a vertical hierarchy that prioritized the survival of the leadership and the storage of essential supplies. These chambers were often connected to deep-water river exits, allowing for the movement of people and resources even when the entire area was under a state of total blockade. We are documenting an architecture that utilized the river systems as a secret umbilical cord, providing a link to the outside world that the military forces could never fully sever. This 12-meter sanctuary was the point of no return. For those who retreated to this level, the surface world had ceased to exist. The environment was characterized by high humidity, absolute silence, and a total reliance on the structural integrity of the laterite clay. The investigation shows that these deep vaults were often used as command centers where the strategy for the long-term conflict was drafted. By going this deep, the inhabitants were not just hiding, they were removing themselves from the kinetic equation of the war. The B-52s could reshape the topography, but they could not reach the 12-meter core. This was the final layer of the hollow geography, a subterranean fortress that proved that human ingenuity could outlast the most expensive military hardware of the century. The sanctuary was a testament to the belief that as long as the earth remained, the people would remain. The ventilation mystery is perhaps the most impressive feat of survival engineering found within the abyss. To breathe at 12 meters deep without revealing your location is a challenge that modern engineers find staggering. The investigation has uncovered the use of atmospheric traps designed to mimic the appearance of termite mounds. These hollow, clay structures were built on the surface to look like natural insect dwellings, but inside, they contained a sophisticated system of baffles that allowed fresh air to be drawn down while concealing the carbon dioxide and heat generated by the people below. This was the ultimate camouflage, utilizing the local ecosystem to hide a human presence. These termite mounds were the lungs of the underworld. We are looking at a location where the inhabitants had to master the flow of air to prevent suffocation and to avoid thermal sensors. If a drone or a scout had detected the warm breath of the tunnels, the entire network would have been compromised. The investigation reveals that the ventilation shafts were often booby-trapped or disguised with pungent local plants to throw off the scent of tracking dogs. This was a war of invisible signatures. By engineering their own atmosphere, the people of the tunnels achieved a level of stealth that was unprecedented. They lived within the blind spot of the most advanced surveillance technology of the time, breathing through the very earth that was supposed to be their grave. This mastery of the air was the silent victory of the underground, ensuring that the architecture of the abyss remained a functional, living space. The investigation into the triple-tier underworld leads to a startling conclusion: a society survived by effectively going extinct on the surface. By 1968, the official record suggested that many of the villages in the Iron Triangle were abandoned, their inhabitants either dead or relocated. But the hollow geography tells a different story. The people were still there, they had simply migrated into the earth. We are looking at a location where the population became a ghost presence, maintaining their social and military structures within the laterite clay while the world above them was turned into a moonscape of craters and ash. This was the ultimate human consequence of the conflict, the total subterraneanization of a culture. The investigation confirms that the 250-kilometer network was not just a military asset, but a survival mechanism that allowed a civilization to wait out a storm that lasted more than a decade. When the war finally ended and the people emerged from the 12-meter sanctuary, they returned to a surface that was unrecognizable. But because they had preserved their institutions and their records beneath the ground, they were able to rebuild with a speed that defied international expectations. The architecture of the abyss is a monument to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with the erasure of its geographic identity. The tunnels are now a silent archive of a decade spent in the dark, a hollow history that remains etched into the iron-rich soil of the Vietnamese countryside. To understand the erasure of sunlight, we must investigate the biological collapse of the human body when it is removed from the circadian rhythms of the surface. For the inhabitants of the Iron Triangle, the transition to a subterranean existence was not a temporary stay, it was a permanent relocation that lasted for years. In the 12-meter sanctuary, the concept of a day ceased to exist. The investigation into the health records of the tunnel dwellers reveals a profound physiological breakdown caused by the total absence of ultraviolet light. Without sunlight, the human body stops producing vitamin D, leading to a rapid softening of the bones and a systematic failure of the immune system. We are looking at a location where the population was undergoing a forced biological regression. The skin of the inhabitants turned a translucent, sickly pale, and their eyes became hypersensitive to any flicker of artificial light. The investigation shows that this was a state of permanent physical mourning for the surface. The deprivation was not just a lack of light, it was a lack of the biological signals that govern human growth and repair. In the deep clay, the body begins to consume itself to maintain basic functions. We are documenting a reality where the war was not being fought with lead, but with the deprivation of the most fundamental requirement for life. The erasure of sunlight was the primary weapon of the vertical siege, creating a generation of people whose very skeletons were weakened by the shadow of the earth. This was the invisible wound, a biological deficit that would take decades to recover from, if recovery was even possible. The investigation into subterranean pathology reveals a medical phenomenon known as tunnel sickness. This was not a single disease, but a lethal combination of rickets, fungal rot, and acute vitamin deficiencies. In the high humidity, low oxygen environment of the 6-meter level, the human body became a breeding ground for pathogens that do not survive on the surface. We are uncovering a forensic reality where the skin of the inhabitants would literally begin to decompose while they were still alive. Fungal infections of the lungs and the extremities were universal, and because there was no way to dry clothing or bedding, these infections were impossible to treat. The rickets caused by the lack of sunlight led to bowed legs and pelvic deformities, especially among the youth. The investigation shows that tunnel sickness was the physical signature of the abyss. It was a state of existence where the environment was actively hostile to the cellular integrity of the population. We are looking at a location where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying organic matter. The psychological weight of this physical decay cannot be overstated. To live in a state of constant, itchy, painful rot is to live in a state of sensory torment. The investigation proves that the tunnel sickness was an unavoidable consequence of the survival engineering. To stay safe from the ordnance on the surface, the people had to accept a biological trade-off that left them physically broken. The pathology of the void was a silent, subterranean enemy that claimed as many lives through slow attrition as the strikes did through sudden violence. The labor of the abyss is perhaps the most harrowing chapter of the investigation. We are documenting the reality of women giving birth in the 12-meter sanctuary while B-52 strikes were active on the surface. To understand the psychological pressure of this environment, one must imagine the absolute darkness of the deep clay, punctuated only by the rhythmic, bone-shaking thuds of 500-pound charges detonating above. The investigation into the testimonies of midwives reveals that births were conducted in silence, with the cries of the newborn muffled to prevent detection by acoustic sensors on the surface. This was the ultimate test of human resilience. A child born at 12 meters deep began their life in a state of sensory deprivation and physical danger. We are looking at a location where the beginning of life was inextricably linked to the mechanics of a siege. The labor was not just physical, it was a psychological endurance feat. The investigation shows that these mothers were operating in a state of chronic elevated cortisol, which has long-term effects on the development of the infant. The 12-meter level was a maternity ward of shadows, where the first breath of a child was taken in an atmosphere of recycled, thin air. This is the human-centered truth of the tunnels, that even in the most extreme conditions of the abyss, the impulse to continue the lineage remained. But the cost was a generation of abyss children who entered the world in a state of biological and psychological trauma that would define their entire identity. The sensory deprivation war was a neurological assault on the tunnel inhabitants. Human beings are evolved to respond to the sounds of wind, rain, and the shifting light of the horizon. In the tunnels, these rhythms were replaced by a crushing, absolute silence, broken only by the sounds of the military conflict. The investigation into the neurological impact of long-term isolation reveals that the brain begins to hallucinate when deprived of external stimuli. We are uncovering a reality where the inhabitants suffered from chronic insomnia, anxiety, and a total loss of the sense of time. This sensory void was a form of psychological torture. The investigation shows that the inhabitants developed a heightened, almost supernatural ability to detect vibrations in the earth, a survival mechanism that kept the nervous system in a state of permanent fight or flight. We are looking at a location where the silence was not a comfort, but a threat. The lack of visual depth in the narrow corridors led to a permanent state of claustrophobia that manifested in physical tremors and digestive failures. The sensory deprivation war was a conflict fought in the synapses of the brain. It was a systematic dismantling of the human psyche, leaving the survivors with a form of post-traumatic stress that is specifically linked to the geography of the underworld. The void did not just house the body, it occupied the mind, creating a psychological displacement that made the eventual return to the surface a second, equally traumatic shock. The human consequence of emerging from the void is the permanent shadow of the surface. After spending years in the triple-tier underworld, the survivors found that they could no longer function in the world of light. The investigation into the post-war lives of the tunnel dwellers reveals a population that felt physically and psychologically unmoored. They suffered from chronic agoraphobia, the fear of wide-open spaces, and many found the brightness of the sun to be physically painful for the remainder of their lives. We are looking at a location where the Earth had become the only safe place, making the natural world feel exposed and dangerous. This is the psychological price of the void. The investigation shows that the transition back to a horizontal life on the surface was a decades-long process. Many survivors chose to build their new homes with deep basements or to stay in the shaded interior of the jungle, unable to reconcile their internal geography with the reality of the post-war landscape. The shadow of the surface is a state of mind where the war never truly ended because the environment of the tunnels was never truly left behind. We are documenting a human consequence where the architecture of the abyss became a permanent part of the survivors' internal map. The investigation arrives at a sobering conclusion: you can remove the person from the tunnels, but you cannot remove the tunnels from the person. The psychological price was a total loss of the ability to feel secure under an open sky, leaving a generation of people who are still, in many ways, living 12 meters underground. To understand the preservation deception, we must look at the specific coordinates of the tourist circuits in Siu-Chi. These tunnels have been widened, ventilated with industrial fans, and reinforced with modern concrete to accommodate a steady stream of international visitors. They are presented as a manageable, almost adventurous historical site. But the investigative reality is that these sanitized passages represent less than 1% of the subterranean network. The true architecture of the abyss is a crumbling, oxygen-starved labyrinth that remains sealed from the public eye. We are uncovering a forensic contrast between the stage-managed tunnels and the thousands of miles of decaying arteries that are slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The investigation into the original blueprints reveals a world that was never meant to be comfortable. The actual tunnels were so narrow that a person of average build could barely crawl through them, and the air was a thick, stagnant mixture of carbon dioxide and damp clay. By presenting a modified version of the underworld, the official narrative has successfully obscured the true extremity of the vertical siege. We are looking at a location where the history has been physically altered to make the inconceivable feel accessible. But the reality is far more claustrophobic. The hollowing of a nation is not a theme park, it is a decaying infrastructure of desperation that the modern state has chosen to partially bury. The preservation deception allows for a clean, heroic story, but it leaves the millions of cubic meters of collapsed, toxic, and forgotten passages as a silent, subterranean secret. The investigation into the unmapped grid reveals a forensic nightmare for modern urban planners. While the famous locations are marked on every map, there are thousands of miles of laterite tunnels that have no official record. These are the ghost arteries, passages dug by local villagers that were never integrated into a central command structure. We are documenting a geographic reality where the Vietnamese countryside is a hollowed crust, a landscape sitting on top of a massive, decaying void. As the timber supports of these tunnels rot after 50 years of tropical humidity, the structural integrity of the surface is beginning to fail. We are looking at a location where the ground is a literal memory of the conflict. The investigation shows that in provinces like Binh Duong and Tay Ninh, the unmapped grid is a primary cause of land subsidence. Every new road, factory, or housing development is a gamble against a subterranean history that no one has fully catalogued. The hollowing of a nation is an ongoing geological event. The investigation proves that the war did not just change the people, it changed the very density of the earth. This unmapped grid is a forensic ledger of every village that was forced underground to survive. It is an invisible geography that dictates the limits of modern growth, proving that you cannot build a permanent future on a foundation that was engineered for the temporary survival of a siege. The grid is a silent, collapsing witness to a decade of desperation. The subterranean gravesite is the most somber chapter of the investigation. We must acknowledge that for the lost thousands, the tunnels were not just a sanctuary, they became a permanent, unmarked tomb. During the intense B-52 carpet bombings of the late 1960s, hundreds of tunnel sections suffered catastrophic collapses, sealing the inhabitants inside. The investigation into the recovery efforts reveals that many of these chambers were never reached. We are documenting a reality where the red clay of the Highlands is a vertical cemetery, holding the remains of families who were buried alive by the very earth they dug for protection. This is the human-centered truth of the hollowing of a nation. These are not military casualties in the traditional sense, they are people who vanished into the geology. The investigation shows that in the most heavily bombed zones, the soil is intermingled with the artifacts of a life interrupted, wicker baskets, ceramic bowls, and the rusted frames of bicycles. We are looking at a location where the geography is a monument to the erased. The subterranean gravesite is a state-level secret because acknowledging the sheer scale of the unrecovered dead would complicate the narrative of a clean national victory. But for the local villagers, the hollows in the earth are not just tunnels, they are the final resting places of their ancestors. The investigation confirms that the war is still claiming its space in the soil, holding the lost thousands in a permanent, airless silence that the surface world is only beginning to fathom. The investigation into structural instability leads us to a modern-day crisis of sinkholes and land subsidence in rural development zones. As Vietnam transitions into an industrial powerhouse, the weight of the new infrastructure is pressing down on the hollowed foundation of the past. We are uncovering reports of factory floors cracking and rural roads disappearing into the earth without warning. This is the subterranean debt, a physical consequence of the 250-kilometer network that was never designed to support the weight of heavy machinery or multi-story buildings. The laterite clay, once a hardened vault, is now a source of systemic risk. We are looking at a location where the engineering of the 1960s is sabotaging the economy of 2026. The investigation shows that the hollowing of the earth has created a landscape of randomized danger. In the Iron Triangle, the ground is so compromised that traditional construction techniques are often insufficient. The structural instability is a forensic reminder that the war has a long-term physical cost that cannot be solved by simply paving over the past. Every sinkhole is a puncture in the economic miracle, a sudden eruption of the history that was supposed to stay buried. The investigation proves that the hollowing of the nation is not just a historical fact, it is a contemporary engineering challenge that requires a total reevaluation of how the Vietnamese landscape is utilized. The earth is no longer a solid asset, it is a fragile, honeycombed shell that remembers the weight of the bombs and the desperation of the people who lived beneath them. The human consequence of living on a hollow foundation is a state of permanent environmental anxiety. For the farmers and families in the provinces affected by the tunnel networks, the ground is not a source of stability. They live with the knowledge that the weight of their homes and their lives is being held up by a decaying, subterranean architecture. The investigation has documented a unique psychological state among these populations, a silence of the surface, where the fear of the earth is a generational inheritance. They watch for the signs of subsidence, the cracks in the walls, and the sudden depressions in the rice paddies that signal a tunnel collapse. This is the final verdict of the hollowing of a nation. The investigation shows that the people are trapped in a geographic paradox. The very tunnels that saved their grandparents are now the source of their own insecurity. We are looking at a location where the past is literally threatening to swallow the present. The silence of the surface is the result of a collective understanding that the landscape is not what it seems. Behind the neon lights and the modern factories, the side you've never seen, is a country that is physically hollow, a society walking on top of a massive, unmapped void. The investigation arrives at a heavy truth: the war did not just end, it moved into the foundation of the country, ensuring that the legacy of the conflict is something that the people must navigate with every step they take. The foundation is not solid, it is a record of a century that refused to stay in the past. To understand the Silicon Mirage, we must investigate the golden population narrative, the state-sponsored idea that Vietnam's economic ascent is the natural result of a young, disciplined, and tech-literate workforce. While the numbers on the stock exchange suggest a miracle, the investigative reality on the ground is one of massive geographic displacement. The industrial zones required for the production of semiconductors and smartphones do not appear in a vacuum. They are carved out of the ancestral rice paddies and the former conflict zones of the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta. We are uncovering a forensic reality where the golden population is actually a displaced population, moved from the horizontal freedom of the farm to the vertical confinement of the factory dormitory. This mirage is a strategic tool of the modern state. By focusing the international gaze on the neon lights of Ho Chi Minh City and the high-tech corridors of Bac Ninh, the human cost of the transition is successfully obscured. The investigation shows that the miracle is built on the systematic dismantling of the agrarian lifestyle that survived the 1960s. We are looking at a location where the geography of the past, the small plots of land and the communal villages, is being erased to make room for the sterile, fenced-off campuses of global corporations. The Silicon Mirage is the final layer of the hidden side, a reality where the success of the nation is measured by its ability to separate the people from the soil that once defined them. The golden era is not a return to prosperity, it is a high-speed exit from the history of the landscape, ensuring that the next generation sees the earth not as a source of life, but as a platform for industrial manufacturing. The investigation into Article 1 of the 1975 land reforms reveals the most potent legal weapon in the modern Vietnamese arsenal. This single piece of legislation established that all land is a national asset under the administration of the state. While it was originally framed as a tool for socialist redistribution, it has been repurposed in 2026 as a mechanism for the confiscation for national interest. This is the forensic blueprint for the Silicon Orient. When a global tech giant requires 1,000 hectares for a new assembly plant, the state utilizes Article 1 to override any local claim to the territory. The farmers are not sold their land, they are compensated at rates determined by the administrative body, often at a fraction of the eventual market value. This is the legal hollowing of the nation. We are documenting a reality where the ancestral rights of the population are secondary to the strategic requirements of the trade alliance. The investigation shows that Article 1 is the primary driver of social friction in rural provinces. Families who have worked the same soil for a century find themselves legally evicted in a matter of weeks, their history erased by a stroke of a pen in a distant bureau. We are looking at a location where the law has been engineered to facilitate the miracle at the expense of the individual. The 1975 reforms, which were supposed to protect the people from the exploitation of the old regime, have become the very tool that facilitates their displacement in the new global economy. This is the high cost of the transition, a legal vacuum where the earth can be taken at any moment if the national interest dictates a higher industrial purpose. The high-tech enclosure is the physical manifestation of the Silicon Orient. In areas like the Iron Triangle, where we previously investigated the subterranean survival networks, the landscape has been transformed into a series of hyper-controlled, sterile manufacturing hubs. These are the new abysses, windowless, air-conditioned environments where the rhythmic sounds of the surface are replaced by the hum of the assembly line. The investigation into these enclosures reveals a total decoupling from the local environment. The factories are fenced off from the surrounding villages, creating a geographic apartheid between the high-tech wealth of the export zones and the struggling agrarian reality of the people who live just outside the gates. This transformation is the ultimate erasure of the hollow history. The tunnels and the bomb craters have been filled in, the soil has been leveled, and the landscape has been paved over with a thick layer of industrial concrete. We are documenting a reality where the geography of resistance has been replaced by the geography of compliance. The investigation shows that the high-tech enclosure is a space where the past is physically impossible to access. For the young workers inside, there is no evidence of the chemical occupation or the vertical siege that their grandparents endured on this very spot. The enclosure is a vacuum designed to maximize efficiency and minimize memory. It is a location where the economic miracle is achieved by creating a world that has no connection to the earth beneath it, turning the most contested ground in history into a generic, profitable, and silent industrial asset. The displacement of the agrarian soul is the human-centered tragedy of the Silicon Orient. When a farmer is removed from their land through Article 1, they are not just losing a source of income, they are losing their physical and social agency. The investigation into the new industrial class reveals a population of former landowners who are now forced into low-wage labor within the very factories built on their confiscated territory. This is a total inversion of the natural order. We are uncovering a reality where the expertise of the soil, the knowledge of the monsoons, the cycles of the rice, and the movement of the water, is rendered worthless in the world of the Silicon Orient. This displacement creates a profound sense of psychological loss. The investigation shows that the older generation, unable to adapt to the rigid discipline of the factory floor, often falls into a state of economic and social irrelevance. They become environmental refugees in their own country, watching from the edges of the high-tech enclosures as their heritage is processed into consumer electronics. The agrarian soul is being dismantled to power the industrial labor force. We are looking at a location where the high cost of the miracle is paid in the currency of human identity. The people who once survived a decade of aerial bombardment by living within the earth are now being defeated by a trade alliance that sees them only as a demographic statistic. The investigation confirms that the miracle is a process of extracting the people from the land to provide the cheap, disciplined labor required by the global supply chain. The forensic verdict of the miracle is a sobering conclusion to our investigation into the Silicon Orient. We have documented a nation that has successfully traded its geographic memory for a seat at the global economic table. While the poverty rates have dropped and the infrastructure has modernized, the hollow history remains an unresolved debt. The investigation proves that the economic miracle is not an act of healing, it is an act of overlay. The high-tech factories and the luxury developments are a thin, neon crust sitting on top of a landscape that is still saturated with the remnants of the molecular occupation, the unmapped grid of the tunnels, and the biological sentence of the DNA. This is the final, hidden side. The true price of the Silicon Orient is the permanent loss of the connection between the people and their history. We are looking at a location where the success of the future is predicated on the silence of the past. The investigation arrives at a heavy truth: the miracle is a distraction. It allows the international community and the state to ignore the 4 million victims of Agent Orange, the lost thousands in the collapsed tunnels, and the millions of displaced farmers who are the primary casualties of the modern economy. The side you've never seen is a country that is moving so fast into the future that it is leaving its own ground behind. The Silicon Orient is a magnificent achievement, but it is an achievement built on a foundation of erasure, ensuring that the war is finally won not by the soldiers, but by the surveyors and the corporate lawyers who have successfully paved over the abyss. To understand the engineering of the flow, we must investigate the cascading transformation of the Sripak River. Once a wild, seasonal artery of the central Highlands, the hydrology of this basin has been altered by over 75% through a series of massive concrete barriers. This is not a localized infrastructure project, it is a systematic extraction of kinetic energy designed to power the industrial corridors of the coast. The investigation into the flow rates reveals that the natural pulse of the river, the flood and the recession that once governed life in the Highlands, has been replaced by a mechanical schedule. The water is now released according to the peak hours of the national grid, not the requirements of the ecosystem. We are looking at a location where the river has been turned into a vertical battery. The investigation shows that this alteration has fundamentally broken the connection between the water and the soil. By trapping the flow in a series of deep reservoirs, the state has effectively nationalized the hydrology of the Degar ancestral lands. The Sripak is no longer a river, it is a controlled asset in the Silicon Orient portfolio. The forensic reality is a landscape of stagnant pools and dry riverbeds, where the natural movement of the water is a memory. This engineering of the flow is the primary mechanism of the Highland betrayal, ensuring that the energy required for the economic miracle is harvested from the very people who are most marginalized by its growth. The river has been domesticated, its wild history erased by the sterile logic of the kilowatt-hour. The Degar erasure is the forensic consequence of the flooding of the river valleys. For the indigenous Degar communities, the Sripak was the foundation of the Swidden farming system, a sophisticated, rotational method of agriculture that relied on the fertile alluvial deposits of the riverbanks. The investigation into the reservoir maps reveals that the most productive ancestral lands are now buried under dozens of meters of water. This is a geographic crime that cannot be undone. When the valleys were inundated, the Degar lost not just their crops, but their entire system of food sovereignty and their economic independence. We are documenting a reality where the national interest has functioned as a tool of cultural displacement. The investigation shows that the Degar were forced to relocate to rocky, infertile hillsides where their traditional knowledge of the earth is inapplicable. The Degar erasure is a transition from self-sufficiency to state dependency. By destroying the valley floors, the hydropower projects have effectively dismantled the material basis of the indigenous identity. This is the hollow side of the energy transition. We are looking at a location where the flooding of a valley is a permanent strike against a population's ability to sustain itself. The investigation confirms that the dams are not just producing electricity, they are producing a displaced class of people who have been stripped of their geography and their history, forced to watch as their most sacred agricultural sites are turned into deep, silent reservoirs for the benefit of distant cities. The energy paradox is the central irony of the Sripak River investigation. We are documenting the reality of the displaced, families who live within the literal shadow of the massive hydropower turbines yet remain in a state of total energy poverty. The investigation into the local infrastructure reveals that while the high-voltage lines stretch across their hillsides, they do not descend into the resettlement villages. The electricity is bypassed, sent hundreds of kilometers away to the neon-lit malls and the smartphone factories of the coast. For the Degar, the economic miracle is something they can see and hear, but never touch. This paradox is a form of geographic violence. We are looking at a location where the resources of the poor are extracted to provide luxuries for the urban elite. The investigation shows that the families displaced by the Sripak dams often cannot afford even the most basic electric lighting, relying instead on kerosene or wood fires in the very shadow of the dams that destroyed their livelihoods. This is the energy gap, a physical divide that mirrors the political division of the country. The investigation proves that the hydropower projects are not intended to uplift the Highlands, they are intended to fuel the Silicon Orient by treating the indigenous territories as an unpeopled resource zone. The energy paradox is the human-centered proof that the miracle is a process of exclusion, where the light of the city is fueled by the darkness of the displaced. The siltation siege is the invisible environmental cost of the hydropower cascade. A river is not just water, it is a delivery system for the minerals and sediment that sustain the fertility of the downstream plains. The investigation into the Sripak's lower reaches reveals that the dams have acted as a massive filter, trapping the life-giving silt behind concrete walls. This has turned the fertile riverbanks into a mineral-starved wasteland. We are uncovering a forensic reality where the soil is literally dying of hunger. Without the annual deposit of fresh sediment, the agricultural productivity of the entire basin is in a state of terminal decline. This is a slow-motion ecological catastrophe. The investigation shows that the lack of silt has led to severe riverbank erosion, as the hungry water, released from the dam scours the earth to find the minerals it was deprived of in the reservoirs. We are looking at a location where the very structure of the landscape is being dismantled by the altered hydrology. The siltation siege is an investigation into the hollowing of the ecosystem. It proves that the dams are not a clean energy source, they are an extractive industry that strips the landscape of its nutrients to produce a momentary spark of electricity. The downstream farmers are the silent casualties of this siege, forced to use expensive chemical fertilizers to replace the natural fertility that was stolen from them by the hydropower projects. The earth is becoming a sterile platform, another victim of the high-cost miracle. The submerged memory is the most intimate layer of the Sripak betrayal. When the reservoirs rose, they did not just cover fields, they permanently submerged the ancestral burial grounds and the sacred forests of the Digar people. For these communities, the geography is their archive. The investigation into the lost sites reveals that the history of the Digar is now underwater, inaccessible, and decaying. This is the vertical erasure of a culture's spiritual foundation. We are documenting a human consequence where the act of honoring one's ancestors has become physically impossible, creating a state of permanent cultural mourning. We are looking at a location where the state has effectively drowned the past to power the future. The investigation shows that the displacement was not just a movement of bodies, but a severing of the spiritual umbilical cord that connected the people to their land. The submerged memory is a forensic fact that defines the identity of the current generation. They live on the edge of a water that holds their heritage in an airless, lightless void. This is the human cost of the energy transition, a reality where the national interest requires the destruction of the sacred. The investigation arrives at a heavy truth: the Sripak reservoirs are not just bodies of water, they are mass graves for a cultural history that was deemed less valuable than the kilowatt-hours required to illuminate a factory floor. The memory is still there, beneath the surface, but it is a memory that can never be recovered. The investigation into the neon theft reveals the geographic division between the dark, dammed highlands and the glowing industrial corridors of the Silicon Orient. By mapping the light pollution of the country, we can see the physical manifestation of the Sripak betrayal. The highlands remain a void on the map, a dark space that provides the fuel for the brilliant, saturated light of the cities. This is not a coincidence, it is a structural requirement of the modern Vietnamese economy. The neon theft is the final verdict of our investigation into Pillar 4, the borders and divisions that define that side you've never seen. We are looking at a location where the light of the city is an act of theft from the darkness of the interior. The investigation confirms that the economic miracle is a process of geographic cannibalism, where the periphery is consumed to sustain the center. The neon lights are a mask for the energy poverty and the displacement that occur hundreds of kilometers away. The investigation proves that the Silicon Orient is an elite enclosure that relies on the hollowing out of the indigenous territories. Until the light is shared with those who provided the energy, that miracle remains a forensic evidence of a divided nation. The Sripak River is the silent witness to this theft, its water flowing toward the coast while the people who once called its banks home are left in the dark, watching the high-voltage lines carry their future away into the night. To understand the architecture of Decree 95, we must investigate the 2024 to 2025 administrative tightening that transformed private worship into a state-regulated security concern. This legislation was not designed for religious freedom, but for the mapping of the interior. It requires every house church, the traditional gathering place for the Highland communities, to register its members, its leadership, and its specific theological teachings with the local bureaucracy. By forcing these intimate, ancestral spaces into a formal legal framework, the state has effectively turned the kitchen table into a site of surveillance. The investigation into the enforcement records shows that any gathering of more than 5 people without a permit is now classified as an illegal assembly. We are looking at a location where the spiritual life of the community is being used as a metric for political loyalty. The decree serves as a forensic net, capturing the identities of those who maintain a connection to the independent religious movements of the Central Highlands. The investigation reveals that this is the final layer of Pillar 3, the erasure of any social structure that exists outside the direct control of the Silicon Orient. By criminalizing the unregistered house church, the state has removed the last remaining sanctuary where the Digar and Kohochil could discuss their history and their grievances without an official monitor present. This architecture of control is the administrative equivalent of a fence, enclosing the mind and the spirit just as the hydropower dams enclosed the river. The decree is a silent, bureaucratic siege that ensures that miracle is never challenged by the voices of those who were sacrificed to build it. The extradition of voice is the forensic consequence of the 2024 to 2025 crackdown on Kohochil activists. This was not a localized policing action, it was a systematic removal of the community's intellectual and moral leadership. The investigation into the detention records shows a pattern of targeting individuals who linked environmental degradation to the loss of ancestral rights. These are the people who spoke out against the Sripak dams and the land confiscations authorized by Article 1. By labeling their advocacy as anti-state activities or undermining national unity, the legal system has successfully extradited their voices from the public sphere. We are documenting a reality where the national interest requires the total silence of the critic. The investigation reveals that many of these activists have been moved to facilities far from their home provinces, effectively orphaning their communities of their most effective advocates. This is the extradition of voice, a process where the geography of the prison is used to sever the connection between the leader and the land. We are looking at a location where the truth is treated as a contraband substance. The crackdown has created a vacuum of leadership in the Highlands, ensuring that when the next wave of industrial development arrives, there will be no one left to organize a legal or social challenge. The investigation proves that the economic miracle is protected by a wall of silence, built from the forced absence of those who dared to suggest that the cost of the miracle was too high. The voice of the Highlands is currently being held in a lightless, administrative void. The financialization of the fringe is the mechanism of the debt trap. When the traditional Swidden farming systems were destroyed by the flooding of the Sripak Valley, the indigenous families were forced into a cash-based economy for which they were never prepared. The investigation into the rural credit markets reveals a predatory cycle of high-interest microloans designed to fill the gap left by the loss of food sovereignty. These loans are often marketed as development assistance to help farmers transition to industrial crops like coffee or rubber. However, the forensic reality is that these crops are subject to global price fluctuations that the local farmers cannot control. We are looking at a location where the bank has replaced the river as the primary arbiter of life. When the coffee prices drop or a harvest fails, the interest on the microloans continues to compound, turning a temporary setback into a permanent debt. The investigation shows that this debt trap is a form of financial enclosures. The families are not just losing their money, they are losing the last fragments of their land, which is often used as collateral for the loans. This is the financialization of poverty, a system that ensures that Silicon Orient can extract wealth even from the most marginalized populations. The investigation confirms that the debt is a second vertical siege, a weight that keeps the community in a state of permanent economic compliance. The miracle is fueled by the interest paid by people who were forced to borrow money just to buy the food they used to grow for themselves. The Silent House Church is the geographic heart of the resistance. In the face of Decree 95 and the financialization of the Highlands, the clandestine spiritual life of the community has moved further into the shadows. We are investigating a reality where the act of prayer is a radical commitment to memory. These gatherings take place in the middle of the night, in the deep interior of the remaining forests, or behind the locked doors of rural homes. They are the only spaces left where the ancestral languages are still spoken and where the hollow history of the land is preserved through oral tradition. This is a location where the spirit refuses to be domesticated. The investigation into these silent churches reveals a resilient network of underground leaders who continue to provide spiritual and social support to the debt trap victims. They are the keepers of the archive, the ones who remember the names of the submerged burial grounds and the locations of the collapsed tunnels. The Silent House Church is a challenge to the erasure of Pillar 3. It proves that while the state can confiscate the land and dam the river, it cannot fully occupy the internal geography of the people. These are the shadow sanctuaries, places where the community gathers to remind itself that they are more than just a labor force for the Silicon Orient. The silence is not an absence of sound, it is a tactical choice, a way to protect the few remaining fragments of an identity that the modern world has deemed obsolete. The church is the last fortress of the Highland soul. The collateral of identity is the final stage of the debt trap. When a family in the Highlands can no longer repay the high-interest loans, the final confiscation begins. But it is not just the land that is taken, it is the very ability of the individual to exist within their own culture. The investigation into the indebted displaced reveals a human consequence where people are forced to sell their traditional weaving, their ceremonial gongs, and even their family genealogies to collectors and middlemen just to stave off the debt collectors for another month. This is the liquidation of heritage to pay for the economic miracle. We are looking at a location where the past is being sold to fund a desperate present. The investigation shows that the loss of this collateral of identity leads to a total social collapse within the village. Without the ceremonial objects and the land, the community can no longer perform the rituals that define their relationship with the earth and their ancestors. They become geographic orphans, living in a landscape that no longer recognizes them. The investigation arrives at a harrowing verdict: the debt is a tool of final erasure. It strips the individual of their history until there is nothing left but the raw capacity for industrial labor. This is the high cost, in its most intimate form, a reality where the Silicon Orient achieves its goals by turning the most ancient cultures of the region into a sterile, bankrupt, and silent population, ready to be absorbed into the factory floor without a memory to hold them back. The investigation into the erasure of the advocate reveals the systematic dismantling of the Highlands social structure. By 2026, the combination of Decree 95, the debt trap, and the crackdown on Cohochil activists has left the indigenous communities geographically and legally orphaned. There is no longer a public space for the discussion of ancestral rights or environmental protection. The local leaders who once bridged the gap between the village and the state have been replaced by administrative appointees whose primary loyalty is to the national interest and the trade alliances that power the coast. This is the forensic conclusion of the hollow history. We are documenting a society that has been stripped of its ability to represent itself. The investigation shows that the erasure of the advocate is the final step in the transition of the Highlands from a contested territory to a passive resource zone. The side you've never seen is a place where the people are still there, but their voice has been extradited, their land has been dammed, and their spirit has been enclosed by a legal and financial vacuum. The Silicon Orient is a magnificent achievement of engineering and economics, but it is a miracle that has been built on the deliberate silencing of an entire region. The investigation confirms that until the silent house churches are recognized and the debt trap is broken, the Highlands will remain a hollowed-out landscape, a place where the history is buried underwater and the future is owned by someone else. The advocate is gone, and in their place is only the hum of the turbines and the silence of the earth. The investigation has reached its final coordination point, where we must acknowledge the kinetic mutation of the conflict. For decades, the world has viewed the resolution of 1975 as a definitive end to the violence. But the forensic data across all 5 pillars reveals a much darker transition. The war did not stop, it simply changed its pace, moving from the explosive frequency of the B-52 strikes to the molecular persistence of the chemical occupation. We are documenting a slow-motion war where the casualties are measured in generations rather than days. This is a conflict that has migrated from the battlefield into the soil, the water table, and the very double helix of the human genome. We are looking at a location where the violence has been internalized. The investigation proves that the peace of the modern era is a surface-level illusion, masking a biological and environmental siege that has never reached a ceasefire. The kinetic energy of the past has been converted into a steady, silent attrition that erodes the physical and social integrity of the rural population. This is the mutation of a tactical struggle into an administrative and industrial burden. By slowing the pace of the destruction, the perpetrators have successfully removed the conflict from the international headlines, allowing the Silicon Orient to be built on top of a landscape that is still technically a combat zone. The investigation shows that the slow-motion war is the most effective form of conquest, as it allows the victor to claim a humanitarian miracle while the victims continue to pay a genetic and territorial debt in total silence. To understand the geography of the left behind, we must look at the specific coordinates where the industrial miracle intentionally stops. This is the hidden region, the provinces and highlands where the high-speed rail lines do not run and the neon lights of the coast do not reach. The investigation into the regional disparity reveals a forensic intent to isolate the most damaged territories from the narrative of national success. We are uncovering a reality where the economic miracle is not a tide that lifts all boats, but a wall that divides those who have been granted a future from those who are tethered to the shadow of the past. We are documenting a location where your proximity to the former airbases or the dammed river valleys determines your value to the state. In the hidden region, the infrastructure is not designed for the development of the people, but for the extraction of their resources. This is the geographic archive of the hollow history. The investigation shows that the people left behind are the ones who carry the biological markers of the spray zones and the economic burden of the debt trap. They occupy a landscape that has been deprioritized in the trade alliances that power the cities. This geography of exclusion is the ultimate evidence of the high cost. It proves that for a segment of the population, the war is a permanent environment, a place where the sun sets on the same unresolved traumas and the same unmapped graves that were created 60 years ago. The miracle is a localized event. For the rest, there is only the slow, silent endurance of the forgotten. The investigation into the sovereignty of the void reveals how the subterranean abyss and the submerged reservoirs have become the permanent archive of a nation's unresolved trauma. For 50 years, the strategy of the state and its international partners has been to pave over, flood, or ignore the physical remnants of the conflict. But the hollowing of the nation, the 250 kilometers of decaying tunnel and the drowned ancestral valleys, refuses to stay silent. We are uncovering a reality where the geography itself is a witness that cannot be cross-examined or extradited. These voids are the sovereign territories of the lost thousands, and the displaced, holding the physical proof of a decade of desperation that the Silicon Orient cannot erase. We are looking at a location where the Earth is a witness. The investigation proves that the structural instability and the submerged memory of the Highlands are not just environmental issues, they are the cracks in the foundation of the modern national identity. By burying the history in the laterite clay or beneath the hydropower reservoirs, the architects of the miracle hope to create a blank slate for industrial growth. But the void has its own sovereignty. It erupts in the form of sinkholes, it persists in the form of toxic soil lenses, and it speaks through the silent house churches of the interior. The investigation confirms that you cannot build a sustainable future on a foundation of suppressed history. The void is the ultimate forensic verdict, a reminder that the war is still holding on to its space in the soil, demanding a recognition that no trade agreement or neon sign can ever provide. The extraction of tomorrow is the final mechanism of the trade-off. Our investigation into the Silicon Orient has revealed that the success of the modern economy is predicated on the continued extraction of resources and silence from the interior. To provide the cheap energy and the disciplined labor required by global tech giants, the state has systematically dismantled the agrarian and indigenous soul of the country. This is the forensic reality of the high-tech enclosure. We are uncovering a system where the national interest is used to authorize the confiscation of the future from those who have already lost their past. The tomorrow of the coast is fueled by the erasure of the tomorrow of the Highlands. This extraction is the ultimate betrayal of the post-war promise. We are documenting a human consequence where the economic miracle functions as a new form of tactical herbicide, clearing away the people and the cultures that do not fit into the industrial supply chain. The investigation shows that the debt trap and Decree 95 are the modern equivalents of the vertical siege, forcing the population into a state of total compliance. The extraction of tomorrow is not a side effect of growth, it is the fuel of growth. We are looking at a location where the future is being mined from the very people who were supposed to be its beneficiaries. The investigation proves that the miracle is a machine that converts the heritage and the agency of the rural poor into the stock prices and the export statistics of the global market. This is the high cost that is never mentioned in the glossy trade brochures, the systematic hollowing out of a nation's spirit to pay for a neon-lit facade. The forensic verdict of this investigation is that the conflict never reached a ceasefire, it merely evolved into a modern, administrative, and biological siege. We have traced the war from the molecular level of the DNA to the structural level of the Silicon Orient, and the conclusion is inescapable: the struggle for the geography of Vietnam is still being waged. The weapons have changed from ordnance and herbicides to high-interest debt, land confiscation decrees, and the extradition of voice. The casualties are the infants in the peace villages, the farmers in the debt trap, and the families living on a hollow foundation of collapsed tunnels and submerged graves. We are looking at a location where the history is not a series of events, but a physical weight that must be carried by those who were left behind in the dark. The investigation into the 5 pillars shows that the hidden side of the region is the truth of who is being sacrificed to maintain the economic miracle. This is the final human-centered synthesis. The world sees a nation in transition, but the forensic evidence reveals a nation in a state of permanent, slow-motion occupation. The silence of the highlands and the sterile corridors of the factories are the ultimate achievements of a century-long effort to control the landscape and the people. The investigation arrives at a sobering final reality. The miracle is real, but in Vietnam, the future is a debt paid in the blood of those who never left the shadow of the past.